Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for Patching is the Tip of the Iceberg, why most vulnerability management programs suffer the fate of the Titanic. Can everyone please give me a warm round of applause for Peter G? And just a reminder, we'll do the Q&A at the end. If you can please submit your questions throughout the talk as they come to mind through the app. Thank you.
So, there we are. We're on. Okay. Welcome everyone. I know obviously you'll be trailing in, so I'll just kick off anyway. I've got a big slide deck and I don't want to hit you with a rush to get through it too quick. But I suppose also I do have all of the slides that I will provide after, so don't worry if you miss something, it'll come through. So today I'm going to talk about why patching is just the tip of the iceberg. And I suppose look, is this, at the moment, what your vulnerability management program looks like? You're a moment away from hitting that iceberg and one step away from disaster. So what I would probably, encourage you to be is quite open-minded about, obviously, this topic. This is a very challenging one. And today really wanted to kind of, have a bit of fun and bring the story of Titanic and the lessons learned that came along with it, and how we can kind of look at that in, modern management of vulnerabilities. So I've had my own challenge in vulnerability management, and so look, hopefully I can bring some of those lessons that I had in my journey in trying to solve those. So just a quick background. So I've been in IT just over 20 years. I'm a recovering sysadmin. I spent a lot of time behind the tools, continual learner, always adapting, playing, and adjusting things. I'm a mentor. I love kayaking. I have 8 kayaks. I sold one. And look, I work within WA government as a director of cybersecurity in our central operation that supports the public sector. And I really love vulnerability management, mainly because I think it almost feels like an impossible task to solve. Who likes a good challenge in their role, and being having something that you can walk out the end of the day and say, yep, we've knocked off all of this. So here we go. So obviously Titanic, I'm not going to spend too much in the trivia of it, but obviously the unsinkable boat that obviously sunk 113 years ago is obviously on its maiden voyage. A lot of lives are lost. One of the things I think that was kind of the best outcome of this tragic event was how much it actually reshaped what people were doing and how they tackled marine safety. So the actual standards that were put in place, they've obviously evolved since then, but they obviously now still stand there anyway as a SOLAS thing. So anyway, and look, if we look about how we had a cascade of failures within that Titanic, it's actually really fun when I was putting this presentation together, doing my research and going, look, what similarities can we really draw in our vulnerability management processes? And looking at it from a perspective where we had, say, before the collision, all the things that led up to, the disasters that we had. So we had everything like excessive speed, the ship was too long and the rudder too short, and effectively we had a lot of poor training in our staff and insufficient lifeboats. And obviously the vulnerability in the ship meant that obviously the coldness of the iron plates, and hey, hit an iceberg, it just bursts open. But after the collision, I suppose the key thing that was kind of also the things that actually made it, more of a tragedy was all the things that they weren't prepared for and the actions that they didn't take. And so there's obviously 130-year event. There's a lot of, pop science and, manual, recollections of the incident. But when we look at some of the leadership that was there was some absence there, and that really had a big factor in the flow-down effect of how they got people off the boat. And it was problems that we see now, vulnerability management. We favoured first and second class and the crew versus some of the other assets we have. Obviously, we know that there was things that we were signalling out from the ship that weren't being listened to. How many of these things almost look parallel to what we deal with in some of our days. So look, quick agenda that we'll go through is really navigating that scene vulnerabilities, like why it's hard. Do we have enough lifeboats? Sorry, it's a bit corny, I've just kept the theme going. And should I have engaged the bulkhead doors? So some of the typical practices that we've done within the Titanic, they hit the iceberg, they're like, we're unsinkable, we'll just put those bulkheads down. it obviously didn't save them. And are there opportunities to really optimize what we can do to modernise vulnerability management? So to make sure I don't leave anyone behind, obviously a lot of you people know what a vulnerability is, and so I won't do too much on that time, but obviously we know them as CVEs. We know them as 0 days, on the things that we don't know, but there's obviously a lot of things that we don't have a CVID for, or we would find them in like an audit finding as a weakness or observation, and they actually also do, contribute to our vulnerability management and trying to, resolve things in that space. And so obviously the key thing why we do it, we have a vulnerability. We want to make sure that we obviously are managing that in such a way that we can, fix it before it is exploited, because really we don't want to compromise. So really the key activity is what we're trying to always do is be proactive on, enabling us to get in front of that as much as we can before things are actually exploited. So we've got all the tools that help us do this. The vulnerability rating score, it's been around for a very long time. I would argue, obviously, sometimes there is a good place to use this, but others there are not. And so, but what it's kind of done is it's kind of given us a fair bit of a challenge, right? How do we quantify this? And obviously the message sometimes is the sky is falling, the Chicken Little Association. So, and look, really our challenge is pretty tough. So last couple of years we had like a 38% increase in the actual vulnerabilities published that go across, that have been, categorised. Now we've obviously only got up to 2024. I'm pretty sure that will spike up if we get the data and we don't lose the NVD. So, and look, we know, hopefully most of you know why it's so hard. We, once upon a time, as like a admin that worked in everything from like Windows Server 2000 all the way up to like modern cloud, we know why this happens, because we built out networks that we thought, yep, cool, we're inside. We expanded it, maybe had a couple of sites. We went through, cloud came along, so we're like, why not? We just expanded our footprint. And then we let people, work from home. And we got some more cloud services, and we just let a whole bunch more people come in and work from home. And all of that dynamic, threat environment that we have there is very challenging to, look at, because we are so distributed across the environment. So our surface area is really increasing, and as we went through and tried to respond to COVID, we had to do a lot of things really quick. Some people have gone through and actually done the work to bring it back to what should be a bit more secure, but obviously there's still people playing catch up. NVD, I couldn't mention it. Obviously, for those that have not been aware, NVD is a really critical point in our vulnerability management program, and that's what almost happened a couple of weeks ago. Basically, our entire way of categorising and understanding that has almost slipped out from underneath us. Fortunately, it looks like at least we've got another 10 months, and there are obviously a lot more global response to understanding how we can maintain a really good catalogue of known vulnerabilities. But obviously this really is kind of one of those pieces that having that central capability that's able to go through and, categorise and bring everything together that globally everyone uses is such also a critical part of this piece of work. And look, one of the things I think that is now our greatest challenge is how quick we have to respond. So some research from the guys over at VulnCheck. These are great, Patrick Garrity and the gang, they're a really great resource in research and obviously going through and looking at patterns in vulnerability management and obviously going through and categorising it. But we can see a very large portion of them are getting exploited within a very short amount of time. So if we look at even just the combined anything within that first couple of days, 28%. And so that's just when the CV is being launched and being disclosed. The amount of time we have to respond, particularly if we've got that on our edge of our networks, is really, really critical. So thought, well, let's look at some really, even not new examples of this. So who's got Citrix or had Citrix in their environment here? I'm sorry. Citrix Bleed, obviously this was about NetScalers, and I guess they have to live on the internet for them to really be effective. Now, timeline for this was really quick. So Citrix went through and disclosed this. Within a week, we had, Mandiant go through and publish basically this in a blog. It was then obviously the proof of concept was actually out really quick. Pretty much the same day that it was gone through and being available, and people obviously seeing it happen, pretty much day after exploitation happened. And so we know within Australia, DP World was probably one of those people that was impacted. They had a pretty bad, weekend, but they did really well once they got back up and running. But the speed that we have to keep up with is incredibly hard. And so through at least research and vulnerability and through incidents, things like Mandiant actually did go through and notice that this was a 0-day that was being exploited as early as August. So it actually had been impacted out in the wild for quite a long time, but it really wasn't until it really got put on the radar of Citrix. It then made the Kev list really quick, and then people got wrecked. So look, do we have enough lifeboats? And I would argue we are probably drowning in tools. Throwing another tool is probably actually not solving this, but you can see all the list of acronyms that we got there. There's a sea of them. They're all 3 little acronyms and some more, but we obviously have so many tools now that enable us to find what we have. And look, I think one of the biggest challenges is going, well, how do we, bring that together, or are we using them all wrong? If we look at our classic vulnerability management cycle, this is something that's been around for a very long time. The order of these sometimes gets moved around, so ignore that part. But obviously, this is a very cyclic system. Really worked well when we were in our little castle and moat systems, but obviously with a large amount of assets we have that are spread quite globally, well, this actually is really hard to maintain pace. I remember back in my day, when I was on the tools, I would actually go through and have quarterly cycles of this. Clearly not enough to keep up. And we did things like this. We went through, made nice matrices where we're like, yes, we're going to go through and fix all the highs in 10 days and all the lows will be in 100. But really, this is what it looked like. And really, it really just, brought to the fact that we're not really solving a lot in this space. We obviously see things where we throw in vulnerability assessments. We get an auditor to come in and pay them some money, and then the report goes on the bookshelf. We're into the same thing with our pen tests. We go through and we have someone come in, they go through, assess, scope, exploit, find all the things. And then again, single point in time. Well, where does it go? Bookcase. And so really, I suppose sometimes what we've seen is those pen tests sometimes also are just regurgitated vulnerability assessments. I've seen some of them where they just go through and they will just be output of Nessus or similar kind of scanning tool, and what value is that really providing if it's not resolving the remediations? So those patterns that we built into frameworks where we're like, yes, we've got to tick a box, we've done our pen test, it's not really solving some of our problems. And I suppose if we look at something like Titanic, that obviously there's a lot of pop science around this one. It took 2 hours and 20 minutes to sink. Now look, obviously the thing that happened with that one, it went, bow first, snapped in half and went down. And look, one of the things that they, in that, that analysis really of that incident afterwards was, well, would it have made a difference if they did something different? So if they left the bulkheads open, yes, they would have had water come in. But I've come across, articles, one by Robert Gannon, basically say, look, the actual ship probably would have actually been okay for about 6 hours, and then obviously still sunk. It was sinkable, but it would have actually changed the outcome, maybe how we could get people off the boat. Vulnerability chaining is obviously one thing that I think that the difference between what we see is individually within a vulnerability assessment or vulnerability management, we're missing this deeper piece. And so vulnerability chaining is really what we do see adversaries using all the time. And what that kind of does mean is that they actually will go through and just find a couple, lower severity findings, chain them together, and victory. And so what we've been seeing is particularly, and I lead a pen test team as part of my role. I'm not going to speak about that component of my role, but I suppose they do this in their engagements, particularly within internal networks and even some of their web application testing where they gain access to a server. Obviously, they can move on to more things, and it's done not just by hitting one vulnerability, it's normally hitting several. So I thought, where have we seen this really recently? So Ivanti, I hope no one has any of this in the room, but this is obviously an endpoint mobile manager. It's for managing MDM. It made the KED list on Monday. And obviously this actually came to be with some relatively not high-ranking vulnerabilities, but you've smashed the two of them together. You can gain access to the box. You can manage your entire mobile fleet there. And the info was only published on the 13th. So what are we, like the 20th, 22nd? I don't even know what day it is. But obviously the time that it got published, it was only within 6 days, and it's been exploited in the wild. Again, hopefully none of you got that. These ones at least had CVIDs. That obviously made sense. If we look at, say, what we see typically from a typical corporate network, if you've got rid of Active Directory, well done. But most people have not. And so one of the things that we see in some of our pen tests, and we see it in other environments as we go through, if we were to go to an environment with 2 mediums and a bit of info, we can get domain admin through parser hash. And what we have in this scenario is that if we can start off with, understanding the attack vectors that people are actually using, this is where it's actually very valuable. So unfortunately, the one thing that's really probably not shared a lot is, well, how do they actually do it? So there is a few places where we can look though. So the good thing is we've got our folks, particularly Five Eyes, and so we've got CISA, NSA. They went through, published pretty much the top 10 security misconfigurations. Broadly speaking, obviously we've got software patching. That's just obviously the vulnerability that needs a patch, but they listed these 10 things. And I know if I draw the parallel for the tests that we do, most of those actually pop up all the time, but we don't actually do them as part of our vulnerability scanning. We don't fix them. And so most of the things that I would see in some of the tests I've seen is security misconfigurations is pretty much our hot number one that we have. Obviously then followed by access control, over-provisioning of access, insecure design, so we haven't got data sanitization on some of our web forms, and we can just inject stuff. And then obviously disclosure, so if we've got too much access, the data leaks, whether that's just through an open file share, AWS bucket, the list goes on. They don't get picked up in your vulnerability scan. So what we can probably, the key thing is out of this one is going, well, how do we get to secure configuration if those are the kind of the problems? And so there's kind of a few pieces here. Everyone wants secure by default. So this is the idea that the vendor gives you something and, well, you might have to soften the configuration of it to make it usable. Wouldn't that be good if we got there? In the meantime, what we have is that top one, security hardening. So this is the stuff that you've got right now that you probably want to start looking at. And these are really simple surface area reduction components to incorporate into that vulnerability change management piece to go through and, start to implement them easier. So 2 really great examples of that, Microsoft Security Compliance Baselines, all very deployable. We'll go into that a bit later. CIS, the benchmarks there, very good explanation of this is the setting, what does it do, what is the rationale, what the best look like. And then, as we go through and implement things, making sure that we are deploying software with consistency. So I've looked at environments anywhere up to about 50,000 assets in their network, and it's really obvious to see how people are managing software. So you might see 7 different versions of the same type of application, all different versions. And so how did we get there? Or maybe we didn't have a good process. Making sure we're onboarding our systems in a way that we're not just keeping default credentials because they're really easy. And in a test, they will pretty much always go through and fail if they haven't gone through and changed it. And visibility of services. So do we need to expose RDP on our machines as an example, as a movement that would be heavily attacked if we don't need it? So there's probably a few things in this, more what I'd be looking at is how can we go through and fix this? And you'll hear this over and over again. Obviously, if we don't know what we can't see, we can't protect it. And so there's kind of two parts to this, the asset management and prioritisation, where really what we really need to get to a spot is because we just can't keep up with our attack surface and all of the assets that we're trying to manage. How can we do it? And really, automated is pretty much where we need to get to. I've seen people smashing things with spreadsheets and it just doesn't work. It's not efficient, it takes time. Remember our timeline, we only had a couple of days maybe to go through and get on top of these. If we're mincing it in Excel, we're not going to get there. And there's two parts to this. There's one of the things that obviously we want to understand what is visible, because that really obviously needs to drive what maybe is known knowns out of it. The other part is going, well, what should be there? And so one of the, I guess, the important parts about that discovery part is making sure that we understand also what is not visible, as in the gap. And so there's a few kind of ways you can try and do that, but obviously having that data that comes into a central repository where you can go, well, I've seen this asset, it's dropped off, I haven't seen it for a week. Maybe I don't have to prioritise it, but we'll see it come back. There are instances though sometimes where you might have a set of tools, one sees it, one does not. So really what you'd probably need to do is start looking at going, well, can you bring that into a central data warehouse, or can you run some analytics over it? I know personally I've worked with a number of agencies that we try to develop out, say, Power BI tooling that's pulling from like 3 or 4 data sources and mash that all together to go, what is connected, what is my asset in there as well. Kind of the second part that I look at is prioritisation. Now look, for those that are in government, you'll be quite familiar with things like Essential 8 and the timeline requirements on those prioritisation. I believe that obviously if we're trying to obviously solve this problem, we really have to have clear direction of what the expectations are and also communicate that back up. So for those that have been in IT or security long enough, you always have these conversations going, oh, we can't lose any data, therefore our business continuity says, well, we have to have real-time replication and not lose anything. Like, well, who's going to pay for that? And there's often this kind of juggle of how we get to that number, what that timeline is. Same thing probably needs to be allocated to what your resources are. So in the case where we've got something like this really is aligned to something like Essential 8, if we were trying to think attack surface, so anything on the internet, is that thing that we want to have daily visibility and have really fast remediation, because those are the things that are going to get hit. Obviously, that means that if we've got critical exploitable, obviously we want to go through to that 48 hours. Who in the room could probably say that they are doing 48 hours for most of their patching on the internet? Oh, 1, 2, a few. All right, so we've got about 4 or 5. That's scary. But obviously the other part is going and having those conversations with your senior management. Go, those crown jewels that you've got, the most valuable IP, the most valuable assets to your business continuity, we want to obviously make sure we prioritise that. So normally what I use for this, particularly when we're reporting and understanding what we have upstream, is you could use this, I guess, format, and actually just, instead of going, here's a number of vulnerabilities, 50,000, 100,000, a million vulnerabilities doesn't mean much to them. But if we could go through and just have this traffic lighted and say, look, I'm actually keeping up with my scanning. I'm keeping up with my remediations. They'd actually probably understand better where you're going to be struggling with your program and trying to go through and go, well, look, how can we go through and support that better so we can resolve risk and reduce risk. If you're obviously using purely the number of, we have 1 million vulnerabilities or whatever that number is, everyone's going to get desensitized by that for one. And 2, you're probably going to go, oh crap, we're only down to like 990,000 vulnerabilities, which is obviously, you've done all that work and you've only eliminated 10,000. So this is kind of a strategy that I've certainly used in the past to help drive that conversation, where at least we can go through and keep up with cycles of patching. Most of the things like frameworks do go into, I guess, that timeline as well. And then because we obviously can't patch, we can't patch everything. I've seen reports in the last few months have said pretty much most people are only really patching maybe 10% or less. So why would we start trying to keep whacking down, I guess, patching if we haven't got good configuration around our systems? And so this is where, like, if we're starting with that security configuration first, we'll actually probably reduce some of those attack vectors. So in the case of that one where that chain was there for Active Directory, which most people have, going through enabling, applying things like this list of things, like from the blueprint, or going through and applying the security baseline compliance toolkit from Microsoft to that infrastructure, yes, go through and roll it out in a change stage way, you'll actually reduce a lot of that surface area immediately. Things like the compliance toolkit really do have really easy deployable tools. They come with basically a bunch of group policies. You could take them into Intune or whatever other system you want to manage it. And real good documentation says this is what the best recommendation is and why. CIS benchmarks, also very good publications that they have where they'll explain for about, I think it's about 50 or 60 different products, what does secure configuration look like. Would highly recommend getting it. You do have to take your email address and then you get access to all of those resources. When you're obviously applying it, they do have a licensing model, but you can look at all the guides that say, go through and look at these documents. They give both the rationale and what the best recommendation is. Obviously, there's the other things that don't fit into the bucket of what they list as documented. So really the other thing is talk to your vendors. Do they have the best security configurations? They should know their product better than anyone. Continuous monitoring. This is the hard part, keeping pace with that. But it's quite important, given that the pace that we have to keep up with, the really important part is look, continuous monitoring is something that we can't just do this in a quarterly fashion or even a monthly cycle probably. That is not fast enough to respond to these risks. So if we look at things like these frameworks that we got the ACSC's Essential 8, the ISM and NIST Cybersecurity Framework, and say if we look at an example, the CIS Top 18, its number 7 is continuous monitoring. They recommend even just monthly cycles. I have come across people that do have challenges in, rolling updates where they're not keeping up that cycle. It's really challenging for their security teams to go through and do an extensive testing. The other one is really threat-informed prioritisation. So you will have heard so many of the conversations around here, coming up that risk profile and understanding really how we can prioritise it. But where do we start? So love this diagram as well, very easy to kind of conceptualise, particularly on a remediation, prioritisation. Obviously you run this against your actual assets that actually matter the most as well. So it does mean a little bit of kind of assessment in kind of taking it into that matrix that I showed you that didn't work. But I suppose what we don't want to focus on the things that actually aren't vulnerable or exploitable at this stage. And so we do know that anything that's kind of being put up in that, say, known exploited, that's the stuff that's in the KEV list. That is the stuff that is being monitored by the Five Eyes and similar, government organisations to at least inform, organisations what is being attacked and that they should probably pay attention to these. So I know always when I look at bringing my threat intelligence there anyway, I'll bring in that as a data source going, is it on my KEV list when I go through and assess this? Because if it is, there's known exploits, people are doing it out in the wild. Obviously, not all vulnerabilities are disclosed. Fortunately, there are some that, don't actually have a proof of concept, but it is inevitable that at least one time someone will reverse engineer it. We see it all the time with some of the firewalls where a patch gets released and they figure out, well, what was actually fixed. Happens all the time. The other one that I do also like to have this threat-informed view is there's another model to help you assess and prioritise. So EPSS, developed by First. It's kind of looking at, everything in this is actually looking at a probability of, is it going to probably be exploited in the next 30 days? And what we end up seeing is pretty much, if we're mapping it against CVSS, which obviously kind of puts us in that high territory, our bang for buck kind of falls off once we kind of get past the 9s of what's the likelihood of that actually going through and actually resolving the issue. But once we get pretty much, if we look at, say, anything below, say, 7 from a CVSS score, we pretty much only really solving 10% of our problem. So now, the one thing that obviously is kind of changing in vulnerability management, and a bit of a plug, so David Coleman is presenting next on CTEM. Now, CTEM is something that Gartner came up. There's a love-hate relationship with Gartner for me. They spam me a lot, but they obviously come up with really great ideas that people pay a lot of attention to. And it is that notion of like that modernisation of vulnerability management. So really, CTEM is really bringing together that same similar life cycle, but trying to actually be a bit more tactical in taking action faster and bringing that through. I'd recommend for those that in this room that still want to continue on that conversation, he will dive into it a bit deeper. But obviously, when we're looking at all of the, platforms are now starting to, take into consideration CTEM, which is really continuous threat. I can't even remember what the E stands for. Exploitation management. I think it is there, sorry. Muff that. Actually, no, it is up there. Exposure management. My bad. And really, that is what is now, what we're seeing is a good shift to start moving at. It does enable that faster timeline on turnaround. But the thing is, though, we're still struggling to patch. It may actually go through and obviously solve our prioritisation, but is it fixing it? So some of the last things we need to look at is we've got a lot of technology that has the ability to be orchestrated. The cloud is one example where if we're doing things with ClickOps and just manually clicking, deploying, we're going to stuff up. This is why we've got such hyperscalers that can do infrastructure as code. Why are we not applying these principles to our endpoint management, the stuff that people are using all the time? And I suppose one of the things I know within my journey going through as a sysadmin, I think I went through and was able to automate probably about 20, 30 applications in our automation of deployment within our applications. I'll probably save like 80, 90% of my time, and I could actually focus on better things. And so the automation of patch release, it does take a bit of faith in your team. But if you go through and follow your patch release cycle and your change management process, which for those that haven't been in IT long enough, ITIL, having that rollback plan, understanding how we could come and recover if we did have something go wrong, is obviously ringing out that deployment. So we've got a real opportunity where we can go off and do that. And look, I know there's some organisations that I've gone through and spoken to, and I said, so when was the last time you actually did a patch and it didn't work? They actually said to me, well, I can't really remember. Like, well, why would we stop the motion to try and go through and solve that and just automate that out? Now, look, if we ring it out, we've probably got a high chance that we're going to stop it from impacting the business. But obviously, that's one piece. This last piece, really, that having this is we can do this by driving better value across the organisation through changing this process. But what we do need to do is we need to change some of the habits between our teams. So this is what we obviously see a fair bit. We've got the security team, one side, throwing Jira tickets or whatever ticketing system you have with that. That is not driving value in what your organisation is going to do to get to the bottom of this. So if you're the security team, my first start would be going, what are the common things that we're seeing in all of these aggregated data sources, whether that's a CTEM platform, your current vulnerability management platform, or whatever system is bringing that all to your attention. Look for the systemic things going. If we have 20 versions of Notepad++ across the entire environment, is that saying we've deployed it wrong? Or other ways that we can say, well, let's just make sure we have one way to install this application and it actually gets deployed constantly in a consistent manner without going through and having someone do it inconsistently. It's unmanaged. Because that's obviously, if we spend all that time focusing on, where we introduce software into your environment, that is actually probably going to be your largest cause of your vulnerabilities. If we fix that process, we can probably go through and keep on top of that through automated patching mechanisms. So without kind of listing all the brands, we do have things like Patch My PC and those kind of RMM tools that do have that ability where they actually go through and just deploy the latest version at the time and maintain it. That does take a bit of culture shift in your organisation, but if you build that trust between your teams and they're not just seeing the throwing of those tickets across the fence, it's really going to help them just go, oh, it's just actually security helping us enable the organisation versus going through and just keeping throwing us problems. So there are probably some other pieces where you could go through and look at this. So when we are looking at, say, modernising that first step and getting that software there, getting your security teams involved, talking to people as they deploy projects, getting the involvement there will drive that value. Eventually, it will obviously go through and hopefully long-term payoff. The balance is obviously we've got to keep up that pace and then find those opportunities that take longer. There is that balance. I know some of the automations I spent doing, you obviously don't want to spend a whole month solving something that only takes you 5 minutes. So it is really about being sensible how you apply that with your teams. So if you can resolve it with your MOE teams or your server admin teams, your infrastructure as code teams, to make sure it's actually resolved at that first point before it's deployed and have a really consistent manner, that will drive value. At the end of the day, I think as employees for organisations, we're always having to look for ways to solve their problems. This is just one of those. And so if we don't have those really quite open conversations with your IT teams or the teams that are helping achieve and patch, keep up with things, you will probably not, you will be distracted and keep having to come back to patch, and throwing those tickets over. The second thing I'd probably kind of look at as well is going like how that communication with your executive. So the example that I had in that remediation, prioritisation, little table there before was going, highlight where you've got good success in it. Are you keeping up with the pace and are you not? So that's the takeaways. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Fantastic. We do have a few questions that have been submitted via the app already. If you have some more, we'll try to get through them, but please submit them. First one is, would your recommended approach to look at the hardening of cloud looking at the hardening cloud in or on-premise out, and maybe talk through where you see as time is always limited?
I'm not sure what the question really was, but I'm going to take a guess that if we're going to start, obviously hardening those systems, we obviously need to start with a good baseline. There are things like in Microsoft Cloud, they do have Secure Store. That does actually pick up a fair bit of your baselines in there, but it doesn't cover them all. There are some really explicit guides. As an example, SIS does have them. That does step through all the configurations that's recommended in theirs. Again, the ASD blueprint is a really good set of examples that they at least apply to the federal government. Now that might need an adaptation to make it functional for your context. But I think if we look at, say, cloud, that is obviously always online. Your on-premise, yes, it may be behind a firewall, but obviously you're having more users that may be able to interact with it. So it does take an approach where try the baseline first, roll it out and stage it. I know as a sysadmin, when I rolled it, it upsetted me a little bit and having to adapt. It may have that flow-on effect, but kind of start small and then iterate from there. So
Fantastic. The next one we do have is, do you have any suggestions for how to assess potential chains of vulnerabilities that aren't included as chains in advisories at scale?
There's a few resources I typically rely on, and I suppose the ones that we see a lot of compromising of on-premise particularly through Active Directory. It's a system that hasn't, it's been around for 20-something years, and a lot of people have been pretty fearful to go through and change it. I know the ASD does have some really great guidance around, as an example there, looking at monitoring and hardening of Active Directory, which is like one of those common vectors, because most of the internal networks would be joined to AD. You would then have a lateral movement to any other resource. So that would be one point that I'd start off with, particularly for the on-premise piece.
Fantastic. We did have a couple more questions, but we are out of time, so I'm sure they will find you a little bit afterwards.
And I have gone through, if you would like to grab the slide deck, it is in that GitHub repo. Feel free if you want to connect with me afterwards. The QR just takes me to LinkedIn, so hopefully if you've got any questions, thank you very much for coming. Hope you enjoyed that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.